Hello and welcome along to another episode of In Conservation with. My name is David Lindo and I am also known as the Urban Birder. Tonight's episode, as the whole of the season, or at least half of the season, will be sponsored by the Diputación de Cáceres, which is the tourism board that looks after the northern province of the region of Extremadura in the southwest Spain. It all makes sense when you look at your map. And also Leica Sport Optics. So I'd like to thank both of those organisations for supporting us. Amy and I go back a little way, and this is her second visit to In Conservation with, and I'm so happy that she said yes. And before I go any further, Amy, how are you and where are you?
I am very well. I'm a little bit weary, but aren't we all these days? Everything seems to be catching up with us after the pandemic. Life has accelerated somewhat. And I am at home in Yorkshire.
You weren't at home a couple of days ago. I've been tracking you. And, you were sort of in the vicinity of the COP26 in Glasgow. Now, before we actually start talking about trees, let's have a chat about that, because that ultimately affects trees, it affects everyone. The question I want to ask you, the first question is, do you believe anything's going to happen? Anything's going to change?
I believe people are changing, and I believe change is coming from the people, not necessarily the people that are in that conference centre right now, supposedly leading us. Still talking the talk without walking the walk, but the buzz around it and the determination and the recognition, I think, by people around the world that it's up to us actually to crack on and tackle this problem. I think that is definitely growing. So I have hope. I am a hopeful person. I don't necessarily have faith in global leaders.
Yeah, that's very well put, actually, because I feel very frustrated listening to our so-called leader and the rehearsed one-liners he's come out with, and a few unrehearsed ones which sound so ridiculous. And we living in the UK, we kind of know the truth behind the fact that a lot of those words are, as far as I'm concerned, are empty when you look at the actual reality of it all. So I don't know. I don't know what to think about it. I think that it's kind of people going through some kind of act to show as if, or to pretend as if they actually care and want to do stuff. But all the targets are kicked into the long grass, and then it's just not good enough. It's not present enough. There's not enough stuff being done to make me feel personally that there's going to be a change.
No, that's right. I don't get any vibe from him that he's actually done any research or that he actually understands any of the issues. He's gone to some advisor and said, "Oh, what do I need to know about?" And just he's got a sort of a glossing over idea. There's no depth. There's no depth, and there's no acknowledgement of the size or scale and depth and breadth of any of the issues. Sorry, you can probably hear my dishwasher gurgling. Yeah, that's a really depressing thing that he doesn't seem to have taken the time to understand, well, pretty much anything. He seems very, very shallow in his grasp of the issues.
But the thing that worries me is I don't know how. I mean, maybe this is part of the grand plan. We all individually think we have no power, but collectively we're probably more powerful than anything. But we've been led to believe, we've been browbeaten so much to think that we can't make a change, and I'm beginning to believe that in a way. I'm thinking, what can I do? What can I do? It's just frustrating, because I read every day about the forests. I mean, it's the same story every day, all my life, and everyone else's lives. Forests being cut down, rivers even in this country, rivers polluted. Sewage. I don't understand how it's going to end. How is
it's going to end by us. I mean, rivers are a great example. I know I'm here to talk about trees, but I have been writing about rivers lately as well.
You're coming for that one as well. We're going to have
I'll come back for that. But you know, the absolute outrage in the last couple of weeks over the sewage in rivers issue, that's a great example of people power, and it is small grassroots actions that have brought that to public attention, and have, you know, changed that bill that was going through Parliament. So, you know, that there is power in small people. Just watching Greta Thunberg today in Glasgow, you know, this tiny little person, this little girl. I mean, she is, you know, she's physically very diminutive, and obviously so young. You know, if she can change the world the way she has, then, you know, the door is open for any of us to have a go, and that's how the change will happen.
She was it not her that said that she wasn't actually officially invited to the conference? What's that about?
Goodness knows. I
mean, if you're going to be doing a lip service thing, invite her. You know, because that is the best kind of lip service you can do. At least it looks as if you're trying to make it, you know, acknowledge.
Yeah,
people.
well, so maybe it's more powerful her not being there officially. You know, she has total freedom to say what she wants to say and what needs to be said. And she's going to take it. She's going to take every opportunity.
Good. Well, let's hope so. All right. So Zoomers, for those who are unfamiliar with Amy, let me just quickly run through who she is and what she's about. She's a biologist. She's a writer, as she said, based in North Yorkshire. She's a country diarist for The Guardian and a columnist for British Wildlife, and you write regularly for BBC Wildlife and other magazines. You've written more than 30 natural history reference books. Wow. I doff my cap to you. But you've become better known for your more personal creative nature writing and your campaigning, not least for access to nature, equality in the nature sector, and nature-friendly farming. And she's here today because last year when we were talking, I forgot what we were talking about now. We were talking about some women. We were talking about women in the sector, and you did say that you were writing a little book, which actually I have in my hand here, A Tree a Day. And I thought to myself, yes, you must come back. And I now have the book in my hand, and you know what? It's very different to what I expected. I thought it'd be one of, because the thing is, and I think you and I have spoken about this, maybe not on the record, but the thing is, a lot of nature books now all look the same. They've all got the same kind of front covers. They've all got the same format in terms of, you know, nice drawings in there and stuff like that. But it's all almost identikit, copy and paste, but obviously different subjects. But then I open this book, and there's wonderful photos in there. There's photos of trees and landscapes. And for me, it just brings it more to life. You kind of almost, in fact, some of the landscapes you can recognize, you've been there before, seen the trees before. And for me, it makes it much more exciting to read, because I'm not a natural reader, Amy. And by that, I don't mean, you know, I obviously can read, but sometimes I look at some of the books and I'm thinking, oh, this looks like hard work. And then you get into it and it's great. But I also love the idea of being able to sort of jump in and jump out of things. And this is a classic book whereby you can just read a few things before going to bed at night, dream about the trees, and then wake up next day and think, where do I go tomorrow? So was this the sort of general idea from the very start?
Yeah, well, this book was a bit of a lockdown project, really. It is part of a series, and I know what you're saying about a lot of publishing and nature publishing is quite formulaic. And this is the third in a series that Baxford have produced. So they did a cloud a day, and then Dominic Cousins wrote a bird a day for them. That came out last year. So this is the third. So it sort of has a formula in that there are 366 entries, and there's a picture for each one and a small amount of text. But I was very, very keen, because of the many different ways that people know trees and love trees. I wanted to try and represent all of those things that trees mean to us. I didn't want it to just be a book of 366 different tree species, because that's been done. I wanted to reflect the the nature of trees, the nature that's associated with trees, but also the history that's associated with many individual trees, and the mythology and the spiritual attachment that's to lots of trees, the mythology, the art. So there's lots of, as well as the photographs, there's lots of art, some of it's contemporary, some of it's more classical. So it literally has got a bit of everything in it. Individual trees that are known for their longevity or their size or their location, others that are known for their ability to survive in extraordinary circumstances. The trees that survived the bombing of Hiroshima and the tree that survived the World Trade Center crashing on it on 9/11. The trees like that are there as well. So there's stories from around the world that reflect our knowledge of trees, our understanding of trees, our appreciation of trees, and most of all our love of them as our fellow earthlings. They are our relatives, and I feel that quite strongly. That the human story began in trees, and has continued with them. We've evolved with them.
Have you ever hugged a tree?
I hug trees all the time. I kiss them quite often. I have there's a particularly the Sheffield trees. I think some of the Sheffield tree tree campaigners might actually be on the webinar tonight. And there's some very special trees in Sheffield which I gave quite meaningful hugs a couple of years ago when they were threatened with felling. But yeah, I'll hug them all the time. And hugging a tree is a really good way of seeing it differently, because it requires you to literally get up close enough, not only to see the detail, but you also smell it when you're that close. And trees do have a smell that's part of the experience of being in them. And I think we lose that when if you stopped climbing trees when you were 14 or wherever, you might not have actually absorbed that smell for a while. So I definitely recommend, after you've finished listening to this or reading the book, going out and getting properly up close and personal with the tree. If you can climb it, all the better. Definitely a hug.
Yeah, I've hugged trees, and it's interesting because they also have the warmth about them. They feel warm. It is quite a thing, and I just hate how the media sometimes see conservationists as they put it, tree huggers. Because I think hugging a tree is a very powerful thing.
Well, the original tree huggers are in the book. Actually, there was a group of Bishnoi Hindus in India, just about 600 years ago. The trees around their home were threatened with felling to build a new palace for the Maharaja, and the women of that community got together and said, no, these trees are sacred, are special, they are our family. And they put their arms around the trees to protect them from being felled, and were killed. And then that led to an uprising in which hundreds of their community were killed, and led to an outrage. And eventually the Maharaja found out what was happening and called a halt to it. But they were the original, that's where the tree hugger term comes from. So it's a powerful thing to do, powerfully protective thing to do.
You just talked about climbing trees. When was the last time you climbed a tree?
5 days ago. 5 days ago.
And by climbing, how high did you go? Were you actually high enough to call the fire brigade? Or?
No, it was a very easy tree to climb. So yeah, it was one of those where you just sort of feel almost like you're going up a set of stairs. It had very generous branches, one that just sort of begged to be climbed.
You know what? I can't actually. This is terrible. I can't remember the last time I climbed a tree, because I used to as a kid, and I think I was one of those people who suffered from, being told that it's dangerous, and there's a lot of PC business going on about kids climbing trees now. What would your answer be to councils kind of saying shouldn't climb trees?
Occasionally you're going to climb a tree and a branch is going to break and you're going to fall out and hurt yourself, but there are 1,000,001 ways to hurt yourself. I would encourage anyone to a go at climbing a tree. I mean, obviously use your common sense, but it puts you into a different world. The tree I climbed last week was actually had actually fallen, and the reason we were climbing it was to cross.
Oh, it's horizontal.
Well, yes, part of it was, its trunk was, but it was across. We were in Glenfeshie in the Scottish Highlands, and this tree was the safe way across a very steep burn that was washing down the valley side. And the tree was an ancient Scots pine that had fallen and been washed down the burn, and was providing a bridge. So that was, so we used that tree. And as we were climbing along it, you can see all the holes made by woodpeckers and by insects emerging from the wood, all these details that are normally the privileged view of squirrels and birds, and yet having the ability, because this giant had fallen, to actually walk among its branches quite easily. It felt very privileged to sort of see that world up close. So yeah, a fallen tree is a great way of exploring a tree close up. Without risk.
Sorry, I mean, I was when I was in lockdown in Spain, I remember being in a square somewhere, and I was watching some kids, and they were actually climbing trees and hanging off the trees and stuff, and instinctively I was thinking, oh, where are the parents? And then I suddenly thought, hang on a minute, this is like what we used to do when we were kids, and they're still doing it now, and I think you're right. I think you have to. I think you have to kind of blood yourself in a way by falling out of a tree. So
definitely, and it's a way of marking time. My son's got favourite trees locally that he climbs, and we've you can mark the years of his growth by how easily he can get into them and which branches he can reach. There's one outside our local pub that we walk to quite often, particularly in the summer, because it's got a nice view in the summer, and he used to need help to get up, and then one year he was able to jump and reach the first branch himself and climb up, and now he's all over it. And so you just sort of notice each year that his relationship with that tree has changed as he's growing faster than it is.
When I was
it's a friend of his, that tree.
Yeah. When I was a kid, when I was about 5 or 6, my mum and dad had an apple tree in the cooking apple tree in the garden. And it was a tree where I kind of saw most of the birds I saw during the period of that time from my window. And I used to climb it a lot. And I used to sometimes climb it and then sort of snuggle up next to the trunk and try and sort of act like a bird as if I was roosting. Because I had this thing about trying to be a bird. And I thought if I stood and sat in the tree, they would come and see me as a big bird and just come next to me. And they never did. But I just wish that, I should start climbing again, actually. Maybe I should try.
When you find a space like that, a place that just where you feel as though you're being cradled by the tree, there are some where you feel secure enough that you could actually fall asleep. And that's heaven, just to be held in the arms of a big, comfortable tree is something really special.
Yeah, I'll be afraid of letting go, though.
Yeah, well, if it happens, it happens.
I always remember that scene. I can't remember what film it is. Maybe you all know this one, but it's when this guy was escaping from some prehistoric people, and he climbed a tree, and they were drinking. There was like a lake or something next to the tree. They were drinking, and he made a slip, and something fell from the tree like a fruit. But these creatures were not intelligent enough to look up. They just looked at the sort of maybe a little bit up, then looked at the fruit and then ate the fruit. So he was, got away with it. Why is it that trees do not get much press? I mean, okay, birds get press, other taxa, mammals, even insects to some degree, invertebrates, but you very rarely see anything on the news about trees other than when they're being chopped down in vast numbers.
I don't know. In my world, I hear quite a lot about them, and I think they live their lives at such a different pace to ours. We've missed a lot of what's going on with trees. They live their lives in 4 dimensions. The fourth being time to a far greater extent than we do. And so from their perspective, our lives are probably very fleeting and frivolous and silly, and a bit like, you know, insect lives are to us. So I think out of sync, we're out of step with them time-wise. But the more we discover, the book I'm reading at the moment is this. Suzanne Simard, Finding the Mother Tree. Suzanne Simard is probably the person who has changed the modern view of trees more than anybody else. She's the forest ecologist who first discovered the extent to which trees were connected under the ground by fungal mycelium. So there's this amazing network of fungal threads that are in all soil, but particularly in forests. And in forests, these threads not only connect with each other over huge areas, but they connect with the very fine root trips of trees. And what Suzanne Simard discovered was that through this network, the trees were able to share resources and communicate. And they sort of used the fungi as well, she coined the term the wood wide web, which some of you may have heard of. And the wood wide web through which trees are communicating and sharing and supporting each other. And not just trees supporting their relatives, although there's a lot of that, but trees of different species are connecting as well. And there seems to be some means by where they can control information and what resources are shared with one another, based on the different fungi that are connecting them. I mean, it's just a completely phenomenal, mind-blowing idea that trees are a community and a family in a way that we didn't really recognize that. Perhaps long ago our ancestors would have done. I think societies that live among trees probably wouldn't be surprised in the way that we have been by that revelation. I think we lost the ability to pay attention to some of what was going on around us. But it's you know, in scientific terms, this has been absolutely kind of groundbreaking stuff. And for me, it's changed the way I think of a forest. A forest is not just a group of trees. It's not just a habitat. It is a community of beings that are sharing and supporting each other. And it changes the way I think about things like forestry. Because a plantation, when you recognize that trees actually need to be connected to each other to live full lives, planting young trees in straight rows where they've already been ripped up from the place where they started growing and been replanted, so they've lost that initial connection that they had with their parent potentially. You know, it starts to feel a bit more like factory farming, and yeah, all sorts of ethical considerations and dilemmas arise when you start thinking of trees in that way. They definitely grow better when they grow when they grow naturally from seed that's been dispersed naturally. So forcing them to grow in a plantation is it ethical? Is it cruel?
You know, it's really fascinating what you're talking about, because I think there's always been, you know, in folklore and cultures, different cultures, the notion that trees communicate. And I suppose sometimes that folklore has been sort of erred onto the evil side of things, you know, gnarled trees moving closer and all that sort of stuff. But it makes total and utter sense, because, you know, they're living beings, and maybe they don't communicate how we do, obviously, but they must have some form of, you know, awareness. Do they move? I mean, excuse my ignorance here, because I'm also representing all the other people not on this in the Zoom room at the moment, who know absolutely nothing about trees, and I think it's really important not to assume knowledge. And I love asking stupid questions because I'm really good at that. Trees move. Yeah, they gradually kind of move, don't they? So I guess if you looked over a time lapse over, you know, 2,000 years or something, would have moved a fair amount. Is that fair to say? Or?
There are different ways in which they move. Obviously, they are moved by the wind but they grow. They can be said in some ways to sleep, because they some of them change their posture according to the time of day. So the pressure of the fluids in their plumbing systems can change, and that can change how, you know, So just as a house plant can wilt and grow, wilt and spring back up, that happens with trees too, but with whole branches. So there's almost this idea that at night the branches might drop a little bit, and we could maybe say that that's a tree sleeping. And over long periods of time, I mean, the position of trees like yews, for example, which tend to lose their heartwood and split. You could go back to what was one tree 1,000 years ago. Now looks like a circle of trees, a bit like the way a fairy ring develops. So they've moved. When I was in Glenfeshie last week, we saw there's an aspen that had fallen. I think it must probably fell last winter, because I was there last year as well, and it was standing then, and over the winter it fell. And now all around this fallen huge tree were literally hundreds of little suckers coming up, and some of them were coming up 30 meters away. So they're coming up from roots that were much further away from the parent tree than you would have imagined them to go. So in the place of this one fallen tree, there is now a little tiny forest of babies all shooting up, but they're suckers, so they're part of the same tree. So you could say that tree has moved as well.
Yeah, which reminds me, talking about community of trees. I was watching YouTube watching YouTube a lot during lockdown, and I was watching these programs about facts and stuff, and I was quite surprised when the question was asked on one of these programs, what is the largest organism in the world? And of course you just suddenly blurt out blue whale, but in fact it's not. And I mean, I thought of this now, I forgot to actually research it, but basically, is it not a tree that has sort of multiplied itself many times in America?
Yeah. So there are several species of tree that do grow into their clonal organisms. So what looks like a whole grove of trees is actually one individual. They share the same DNA. They're attached at the roots. And the one we that's normally quoted as being the largest is known as Pando. And it's a quaking aspen grove in the States. I think in Utah.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
But it spreads over several hectares, and it has tens of thousands of stems, trunks in this one individual. And it probably isn't the largest. It's just the largest that we've been able to prove is one individual. There will be undoubtedly there'll be others, and also as well as the largest organism, it's probably the oldest as well, or one of the oldest. I think estimates for that particular clone are between I think 14,000 and 1 million years or something. We don't know how long it's been there, but it could be as much as 1 million years old.
Wow.
That organism has been putting up stems, and
it's just mind-blowing, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. David, I'm just going to shut the door because.
Okay. Well, whilst you shut the door, I mean,
I keep hearing the dishwasher gurgling. It's probably quite distracting.
It's just mind-blowing. I mean, you don't realise just how amazing these living beings are. It's just incredible. I travel quite a bit, especially in Europe, and I notice when I go to Eastern Europe, especially the old forests. And I remember when I first started my kind of life as a urban birder, and one of the first places in terms of forests that I went to was in Serbia, and I was in this wood, and it was deafening, the sounds of insects. I mean, millions of insects, something that I hadn't really kind of heard for years in the UK. But the fact that when you travel around these countries, I mean, recently I was in Lithuania, and there's this wonderful forests, and you can feel how ancient they are. You can just feel it. And then you come to the UK, and I feel embarrassed because there's hardly any woodland at all. And the only place, apart from Scotland, the only time I get that feeling is in Sherwood Forest. When you see those gnarled oaks, you don't see many dead trees anywhere because they're all conveniently cleaned up. And you think to yourself, well, I think to myself, that's an important aspect of its life when it's dead, because that's when a lot of creatures, can actually use its body for home and food. And I was actually outraged a couple of weeks ago with that research that came out regarding bird feeding, and I've gone on about this before. I can say it again. And the research was basically saying that bird feeding is contributing to the decline of the willow tit. But what it neglected to say was that the willow tit has a very, very restricted range in the UK. So people in Cornwall, Scotland, London are worrying about bird feeding and the population of willow tits when there's no willow tits anywhere near them. But even more importantly is the fact that willow tits use the wood of dead, excavate their nest holes in dead trees. And where are the dead trees? We in this country have had a shortage of dead trees for God knows how long, so address that problem. It just gets me. I can't, I just had to rant about it.
No, you're absolutely right. Our woodlands are hugely simplified in their age structure, and as well as missing the dead trees, the standing and the fallen dead wood, we're missing the young ones as well. At both ends of the age spectrum, they're often lacking. And the young trees, we have a problem with deer in this country. We have too many of them for the amount of suitable habitat. So in Scotland, they're encouraged because of the stalking industry. They want as many deer on the estates for their clients to shoot. But elsewhere, there aren't predators for deer anymore, and so we have more than at any time in the natural history of Britain, and they're preventing regeneration of trees. So our forests look even Sherwood Forest will look very different to the way it would have done back in medieval times, when there would have been more dead wood and there would have been a lot more natural regrowth, which would make it difficult to move around. We have just down at the bottom of our lane is the River Derwent, and alongside it there is a fantastic area of alder carr, so very wet woodland, and it is one of the most hostile places in terms of bipedal movement that I know. It feels, well, my son calls it Dagobah from Star Wars, the planet where Luke Skywalker goes to be trained by Yoda. I don't know if there's any Star Wars fans here, but it's all swampy. There's lots of fallen trees. And it's really difficult to move around because the ground is incredibly wet, and there's just trees and thorns and undergrowth, and everything that's growing there seems to be out to snag you or jab you in the eye. And it's brilliant. I just love it because it's so wild, so uncultivated, and that's how vast areas of the country would have been, and that's what a real forest is like. We have this tidied up idea that there should be nice wide rides that we can walk along or cycle along or ride our horses along, and that there should be swathes of bluebells, and actually no, there should be a big tangled mess that's really difficult for us to move through. That's true wildness, and you have to learn to love that. It's like learning to love scruffy road verges and untidy gardens. You have to teach yourself that is not only ecologically more intact than the tidied up version, but is beautiful. You just have to work a little bit harder at it, I think. And that's what people miss when we're looking at our simplified ecology.
Yeah, because in urban areas, like for example, Wormwood Scrubs, my local patch in West London, one of the things that the council used to go on about in the past was, we can't have undergrowth here because it could harbour rapists and what have you jumping out the bushes.
It could harbour nightingales.
Exactly. I mean, look, I'm not belittling that potential, of course, but I mean, it is it's one of the tiny possibilities. And instead you have these sterile woodlands with trees of the same age, no undergrowth of any real kind of importance. And it's almost not even worth having. I mean, I I don't understand. I mean, again, maybe my ignorance here, but I don't understand why people don't understand the ecology of woodlands. You know, why don't these councils listen to people who understand what should happen, who say don't plant all the trees at the same age because you're going to have, in 100 years' time, all the trees at the same age, young ones. Surely that's not rocket science.
It's not rocket science, but councils are respond very quickly to people that complain about things not being done. And it's, I think, the people that complain about weeds, what they would call weeds, for example, and you haven't cut the grass and there's weeds everywhere, they are more vocal and quick to respond than the people that were enjoying those weeds. We don't involve, particularly with local councils. I don't think we celebrate enough when they do the right thing. So maybe we could do a little bit more of that.
Yeah, but with this book, I must say I'm impressed, Amy, anyway. But this particular book, I don't know. I wouldn't know where to start in terms of what to actually feature. How did you kind of choose or think of the trees per day? I mean, how did that come
That
about?
was the really fun part, actually. I, as I said at the start, I was really keen to include, trees and all their guises and all the different things they mean to us. But I started with a list of trees I knew, sort of famous trees, if you like, the sort of ones that were record holders or had particular good stories associated with them. And a list of sort of classic species that we could feature. So there's probably, I don't know, 50 or 60 species that are just given a little profile in there. And I started looking at art and stories, and it expanded to landscapes and forests. So I went back to the first trees. The evidence of the first trees is they are fossils that are 385 million years ago. That are quarried out of in New York State, and they were the first, or they're the oldest fossils that are recognisably what we would look at and go, that's a tree, because the definition of a tree is quite a slippery thing as well. It's people know a tree when they look at it, but if you asked someone to say, right, what is the defining feature of a tree? That's quite a hard question to answer. They're not a taxonomic group. They're not, because they belong to several different groups of plants. They don't all just have a trunk and a bunch of leaves at the top, like a lollipop, like a child would draw a tree. Some have many stems and they come in all different shapes. They're not all necessarily tall. Some grow along the ground. The trees that grow at altitude, some of them literally creep along the ground, and they're still a mountain willow or a birch that's creeping along at the tree line. They adopt these incredible low growing forms. A bonsai, that's every bit a tree. So we can't just use size and scale and shape. We can't use woodiness even, because other plants that aren't trees, heather is woody and it's definitely not a tree. So, actually classifying what we mean by a tree is quite difficult until you stand someone in front of one and they'll say, well, obviously that's a tree. So I had a bit of fun with that.
Is there a hard, fast definition for a tree?
No, not really. They are plants that generally have stature and woodiness about them, but there's exceptions to pretty much any single definition you try to come up with for a tree. There would be an exception to it. So that's fun for starters. Actually, the publishers nearly put on the cover, they nearly put a rubber plant, which isn't a tree, because it looked like one. That would have been embarrassing.
Yeah, but luckily not.
I got in trouble actually from someone in Australia because the publishers chose to put a plane tree on the cover, and I think planes in cities are, they're rather glorious and elegant and graceful. But if you're a really bad hay fever sufferer, apparently you learn to hate them because the pollen is particularly allergenic. So I got a very angry tweet from someone in Australia who suffers badly Sorry, mate.
That's interesting about plane trees
Please just
because
cover.
I think they've found that the leaves take a long time to break down, and
Mm,
as you say, there's lots of particles that get in the air, which are bad for people with respiratory issues.
mm.
And I was saying that silver birch is a better tree to plant in
Well,
the.
silver birch are great at planting themselves, aren't they? Really great at planting themselves.
Is there any tree you don't like?
Leyland cypress.
Why?
Down when we and that's the ones that people plant as hedges. They grow into these incredibly dense, tall hedges, and there's something about the color of green. They have this sort of bluey green that just looks very synthetic in British context. I'm sure in their native range they probably would be perfectly acceptable if they're allowed to grow into tree form as opposed to hedging. But yeah, they overshadowed our garden. We cut them down very easily, but it took a lot of disposing of. And they provide great cover, great shelter, and people grow them as a kind of screening plant, but they just look wrong. They were the wrong green. So yeah, if I had to take against a tree, it would be Leylandii.
Yeah, I think the tree that I like the least is the one behind me, Eucalyptus. It's a bit of a bane of people's existence. In fact, other animals' existence too. This was in Brazil, and it looked amazing until you realise what it was. You know, it's not the natural, not even secondary growth. It's a forest of eucalyptus, which was deliberately planted to provide, you know, wood for matches and stuff like that. And it's the same scenario all over the world. I mean, in Spain and in Portugal, you know, they're everywhere, and people are still trying to get rid of them, but they just won't go. And of course, in Portugal, they're called the fire tree because they got oil in them. As soon as you know, they just go up like tinder sticks. So it's not one of my favourites. And plus, they drink a lot of water, don't they?
Yeah, yeah.
So not great. For people, I mean, I think trees are quite an interesting subject if you are in that world, just like birds are. And the question I get asked a lot about birds is, how do you get people interested in birds, or what's so good about birds? I want to ask you the same question. How can you engage with someone who doesn't really think about trees other than, I need to chop that tree down because it's in front of my house or whatever, or the root's going to go underneath my house? How do you get people to care about trees?
I would try and get, if it was a big tree, try and get them to think about what that tree had seen in its lifetime, what the history that's sort of been embedded into that tree through its years of growth. Recognition that those trees were here long before we were, and they probably will be here long after us. What you were saying about people chopping them down, I went back to one of my childhood homes this summer, and my mum sold that house in 2008, I think, and I hadn't been back since. And I was afraid to go back because I worried that the tree that grew outside the house, outside my bedroom window, wouldn't be there anymore. But my sister had been there a couple of months previously and assured me that it was. So I thought, as I was in the area, I'd go back and take a trip down memory lane and see the house. And of course, in the 2 months since my sister had been there, the tree had been cut down. So recently, the sawdust was still there. And the house looked different without the tree there. The house suddenly, having been somewhere that I'd known and loved for all those years, looked ugly and blank without the tree. It was an oak, big old oak, probably a couple of 100 years old, I would have thought. And I was so shocked that I sat in the car and just sobbed. I felt like I'd been uprooted or felled. I took a photograph of the stump because I had this idea that I might blow up the photo and count the rings to see how old it had been. And then I drove off, and I was actually going to meet another writer, Nick Hayes. Have you had Nick Hayes on this? You should do. He's a fantastic writer and illustrator and campaigner. He wrote the Book of Trespass. And I was actually going to meet him for the day. And we met about half an hour after I'd had this shocking experience of the loss of the tree. And we're showing him the photo, and I was talking about possibly going back and getting some cuttings from it. And we zoomed in on this photo. We could see there were actually seedlings coming up around the stump. So he was just, hell, let's go and get them. Let's go and rescue them. So actually, we went back at the end of the day, and I spoke to the family in the house, and they said, oh, it was very sad about the tree, but you know, its roots were going to undermine the house, and it kept leaking. It was sick anyway because it kept leaking all this sticky stuff. And the sticky stuff was honeydew, was coming from the millions of insects that were living in the tree, and they imagined that this meant that the tree was in some way moribund. So they had all their excuses ready. But I've now got those seedlings. I've now got 4 little oaks in pots in the garden that are the progeny of that tree. Sorry, I got off topic there. I can't remember what I started talking about.
That's totally on topic if you ask me. I mean, that's quite an emotional story, which actually shows the connections, you know, between us and trees. And I just wish that people were more, you know, knew more about trees. Normal people. When I say normal people, a person in the street who doesn't know much about trees. I mean, I'm sure there's not much on TV about trees, other than when they've been.
I think there will be. I think that, you know, all these discoveries about the way trees communicate, not just through the fungal wood wide web, but also chemically through the air. We know that, you know, they can, if a tree is attacked by a particular insect pest, for example, they can release a chemical that will summon the appropriate parasitic wasp to come and parasitize those caterpillars. So it's not just a generic tree leaking chemicals into the air. It's a specific signal that starts being produced in response to feeding by a particular herbivore or particular caterpillar that summons in the particular wasp that tackles that problem. So trees are communicating. They warn each other, because when other trees sense these chemicals in the air, they'll start producing similar chemicals themselves. So they're communicating with each other, but they're also summoning allies in the form of these parasitic wasps that lay their eggs inside the bodies of caterpillars and kill them off. So, you know, extraordinarily complex webs of communication and communion and community between trees and other species. And we should be included in that. You know, why, if trees are talking to wasps and each other, then why would they not be trying to communicate with us too?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, very interesting concept. In your book, my favourite date is, of course, my birthday in August the 22nd.
I was going to ask which your birthday tree was.
And you got me a big one there. You got me El Grande, so I'm happy with that. What's your favourite date in this book?
Oh gosh, I don't know.
I'd say
I should know which one's on my birthday, shouldn't I?
Yeah, October the 14th is beautiful. It's a really beautiful image here of
oh yes, Hyperion
and giants. A coast redwood known as
so that's the current holder of the tallest tree in the world, likely to be overtaken. Should I hold it up so you can see that picture?
Yeah.
The light's not great.
Which one?
But so that's Hyperion, 14th of October. Won't be the tallest tree for very long, because it's got some young upstarts that are growing close by it, that are growing faster than it is, so they expect it to be overtaken in the next few years. I'm just flicking back a couple of days to my birthday, because so my birthday tree is the ginkgo, or the maidenhair tree, which is interesting. It's a living fossil. It's been around for 250 million years.
What date is it, Amy?
11th of October.
Okay. Happy birthday. Belated birthday.
Thank you. But have I got a favourite? Well, as I was speaking about Nick Hayes, maybe I should find the page that he contributed. Oh, well, this is where I have to make a really embarrassing admission that his name's spelled wrong in the book. This is every inch a pandemic book, in that the editor and I were both homeschooling while it was being produced. And because the publishing offices were closed, we never got to see proofs. There were never any printed proofs. So there are, unfortunately, some typos in it that we would have spotted if we'd seen proofs. One of them being Nick's name. So he's actually in the book as Hick Hayes, which is mortifying for me, but hilarious from his point of view. He, thank goodness, has a good sense of humour. I can't find it, but in here is a beautiful lino cut that he produced to accompany the poem Heartwood that Robert Macfarlane wrote as a charm for the Sheffield trees when they were threatened with unjust felling. So fantastic piece of work by both of them, which was printed and appeared on hoardings and bus stops all around the city when those trees were threatened, and has been translated and read around the world, and has been sung around the world in all places where trees are being threatened with unjust felling, which leads me on actually to the dedication at the front of the book. I'll just hold that up as well on the dedication page.
Yeah.
Those little symbols. That is a dedication written in a font of trees. So on another page in the book, there is the key. The artist Katie Holton produced this font. So there is a tree for each letter of the alphabet, and you can download this font from the internet. If you Google the Irish Tree Alphabet by Katie Holton, you'll be able to use it and create your own words made of tree. And you can, if you choose, use it to decode the dedication at the front of the book. I won't tell you what it says. I'll just leave it to people to work out.
That's a challenge and a half. Big question here, which you may not even be able to answer, but I'm just going to ask you anyway. Obviously, in the UK, for example, there's people that care passionately about the welfare of trees, as in the US and maybe a few other countries. Is that passion shared in places like, in cities in Brazil, for example? Do you think there's movements of people who are, really passionate about saving trees, or is this a Western thing?
No, I know there are. I know there are people all around the world that will put their bodies between trees and chainsaws. And not everyone in a community, there are always going to be, it takes all sorts. But yeah, in the research for this book, I found stories of people advocating for trees around the world, from children to little old ladies. And that's a powerful thing. I think, if you've lived among trees for a lot of years, or a particular tree, they do become, the relationship becomes personal. And if that tree is threatened, then you feel it. I think that's a very instinctive, protective urge.
Yeah, fair enough.
So yeah, no, there definitely there are people all over the world doing what people in this country are doing, and obviously, in all parts of the world there are people that don't engage or that work in the logging industry. But where trees grow in the heart of community, there are so many in towns and cities that the book is full of examples of trees that have names and have history and have folklore associated with them, or that people stand under when they say their marriage vows, or that people go and hang offerings in if they've got a problem in their lives, or they want like a votive offering, a promise of something. They'll go and hang an ornament or make a wish on a tree. Every culture in the world has these traditions, and going back thousands of years. The oldest known written story is the Epic of Gilgamesh, and that is a story about a sacred forest and the consequences of going into that forest and felling a tree for the protagonist of the story. Yeah, it's we can't separate our humanity from the fact that we developed among trees. Our stories are all about trees, and when I think of fairy stories, they're all about the wild woods and the forests. You know, our stories, I believe, come from forests. There's Roger Deakin wrote a fantastic book called Wildwood, and he described a forest. No, he said forests are where we go to find ourselves by first becoming lost, and that sense that when you're in a forest, you can't quite see what's around the next corner. You haven't got a long view, and I think that's probably why they became this place of potential and possibly of threat, but also of sanctuary, because you might not be able to see, but other people can't see you, so it's potentially a safe place. They are, yeah, places of magic, and I use the word magic quite liberally now. I started out as a serious, as a scientist, and we're not supposed to talk about things like magic or love or God, but I think those three things are the same, and in a forest you feel them very, very powerfully.
My favorite tree is the black poplar, because I see a lot of them in Eastern Europe, and I've seen some really nice things like woodpeckers and flycatchers and warblers hanging out in them. What's your favorite tree?
You said you were going to ask me this question, and it's incredibly hard. I've got several favorites. The beech is is up there. The ash is up there as well, because we're going to lose them. But I think on this occasion, just because of the time of year, we're turning into the dark time of the year now, where we value signs of life. I'm going to go for the yew, one of the evergreens, and the longest living individual tree that we have in this country. Some of them are possibly 5,000 years old. And I'm going to go for particularly the yews that grow in the Yorkshire Dales on the sides of some of the limestone crags and cliffs, because they are rooted in tiny cracks and crevices where rainwater trickles and percolates down, and they grow out of the rock and then do a sort of knee and grow up the face of these crags, and they've been there for thousands of years because they're inaccessible to the sheep that browse everything else to oblivion. And excuse my dog, that wasn't me making the groaning noise. Yeah, so I'll go for the yews of the Yorkshire Dales.
And I did ask you this question last year. I wonder if it's changed. If you could be anywhere on this planet, notwithstanding restrictions, where would you be right now?
I think I said the Isles of Scilly last time, but and I think I was hoping to go there on holiday, or had just been on holiday. But now I'm going to go. I mentioned it a couple of times. Glenfeshie in the Highlands, which is an estate that's being rewilded. It's 17 years since they started culling the deer and allowing the trees to grow back, and the regeneration there is so heart-lifting. It's a place that is so good for my soul. It has the ancient trees, the ancient Caledonian pine forests. It's one of the last remnants, and these are Scots pines that look like no others. They are huge beasts. They have the form of oaks. They're so wide and spreading, magnificent, and all around their feet now are their babies shooting up. It's just the place absolutely hums with life. Most hopeful place, I think, in the British Isles at the moment, and yeah, I would go back there in a heartbeat.
Fantastic. Zoomers, just to let you know, there's a couple of other interviews coming up. John Dunn, who's written a book called The Glitter in the Green in Search of Hummingbirds. He's here on Monday the 15th of November, 7 o'clock GMT. And on the 2nd of December, we got a guy called Eric Eaton. He's written a book about wasps. So we'll be talking, funny enough, about wasps. And that's on the 2nd of December. Great. Well, I just would like to wish you luck, Amy, with this great book. Very very, very nice book. Thank you very much for being here today to talk to us about trees, randomly about trees, which is great. 'Cause I like random, and I really hope to see you with your next book, which is about rivers.
It is, yes. It's now with the publisher, so that'll be out next year.
Okay, well, you're definitely coming back then. And Zoomers, thank you very much for sparing your time to watch and listen to us talking. It's always a pleasure to have you. I look forward to seeing you all again. And don't forget, keep looking up.